Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's soothing tales from the past. If you're just settling in for the night, looking to relax or drift off to sleep, you've come to the right place. Before we embark on our journey through the mists of time, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know how far our community of night owls stretches. And if you enjoy these calm, meandering strolls through history, consider subscribing for more soothing tales from yesteryear. Tonight, we'll be exploring a rather somber topic: the treatment of heretics in medieval times. So get comfortable, perhaps with a warm cup of chamomile at your side, and let us wander back to a time long past when the world was a very different place. Our story begins in the heart of medieval Europe, a time when the Catholic Church reigned supreme as the ultimate authority on all matters of faith, knowledge, and morality. From bustling cities to quiet villages, the lives of rich and poor alike were shaped by the rhythms of the church, the tolling of bells calling the faithful to prayer, the celebrations of saints' feast days, the solemn rites of the Mass. In this world steeped in deep religiosity, to be a part of the church was to be a part of the very fabric of society. But hand in hand with this profound faith came an equally profound fear, the fear of heresy. Heresy, in the eyes of the medieval church, was any belief or practice that strayed from the established doctrine, any whisper of dissent against the iron grip of orthodoxy. To the pious of the Middle Ages, heretics were not merely misguided souls in need of gentle correction. No, they were seen as a cancer within Christendom, a diabolical force capable of leading the faithful astray and imperiling their very salvation. In a time when the afterlife was as real and vivid as the world of the living, the stakes could not have been higher. But what was it like to be branded a heretic in those days? What fate awaited those who dared to question the Church's teachings or challenge its authority? How did the machinery of orthodoxy seek to root out and punish these supposed enemies of the faith? These are the questions we'll ponder tonight as we explore the complex and often tragic history of medieval heresy. We'll meet some of the men and women who ran afoul of the Church's strict doctrines, learn about the methods used to identify and prosecute them, and consider what their stories can tell us about the nature of faith, power, and dissent in a world very different from our own. But as we journey back in time, it's important to remember that the people we'll encounter were not mere abstractions or cautionary tales. They were flesh and blood human beings with hopes, fears, and convictions as real as our own. In pausing to consider their lives and struggles, we honor their humanity and the enduring power of the human conscience, even in the darkest of times. So let us step back now into the shadowy realm of medieval heresy and see what lessons and insights we might glean from this often overlooked chapter of history. But let's do so gently, with empathy and understanding for all those caught up in the tumultuous tides of faith and power. Our story begins in the 12th century with the rise of some of the earliest major heretical movements to challenge the Church's authority. In the lush hills and valleys of southern France, a group known as the Cathars began to attract followers with their radically different view of Christianity. The Cathars believed in a profound dualism between the spiritual realm, created by a benevolent God, and the corrupt material world, which they saw as the work of an evil deity. They rejected the Catholic hierarchy and sacraments, instead placing their faith in an ascetic lifestyle and the guidance of their own spiritual leaders, known as perfecti. To the medieval church, the Cathars represented a dire threat, a homegrown heresy that challenged some of the most fundamental tenets of Catholic doctrine. The Cathars' dualistic beliefs flew in the face of the Church's teaching that there was one supreme God, creator of all things visible and invisible. Their rejection of church authority and embrace of alternative spiritual leaders raised the spectre of a Christian world divided against itself. At first, the church attempted to rein in the Cathars through persuasion and debate. Preachers were sent to Cathar strongholds like the city of Albi, hoping to win back the wayward faithful through the power of their arguments and the example of their piety. But as the Cathars' influence continued to grow, the church began to contemplate more forceful means of bringing this heresy to heel. Meanwhile, in other corners of Europe, more challenges to orthodoxy were brewing. In the bustling merchant cities of northern Italy and Flanders, a former merchant turned preacher named Peter Waldo began to attract followers with his radical call for a return to the simple, humble Christianity of the Gospels. Waldo and his disciples, known as the Waldensians, embraced a life of apostolic poverty and took it upon themselves to translate the scriptures from Latin into the local vernacular so that ordinary people could read and interpret the Bible for themselves. Like the Cathars, the Waldensians represented a threat to the church's monopoly on spiritual authority and scriptural interpretation. By making the Bible accessible to lay people and encouraging them to follow the example of the apostles, Waldo and his followers called into question the need for the elaborate hierarchy and trappings of the medieval church. As the 12th century drew to a close, the stage was set for a showdown between the guardians of orthodoxy and the growing ranks of those who dared to challenge it. In our next installment, we'll see how the church responded to the threat of heresy with the creation of a powerful new weapon, the medieval Inquisition. But for now, dear listener, let us pause and reflect on the courage and conviction of those early dissidents, the Cathars and Waldensians, who risked everything to follow their conscience and live out their faith as they understood it. Though their beliefs would be condemned as heresy, their stories speak to the enduring human yearning for spiritual truth and authenticity, even in the face of overwhelming power and prejudice. As we continue our journey through this complex chapter of history, we'll encounter many more such stories of faith, dissent, and the often high price of non-conformity. But through it all, we'll strive to approach these tales with empathy, nuance, and a recognition of the common humanity that binds us across the centuries. For now, though, let us rest and ponder the twists and turns of the path we've begun to tread. The medieval world of heresy and inquisition awaits us still, with all its shadows and sorrows, its moments of courage and its cautionary tales. But we'll face it together in the spirit of understanding and with the balm of history to soothe us along the way. Until next time, dear listener, I bid you a peaceful night's rest and sweet dreams of a world more just and gentle than the one we've glimpsed tonight. Be well, and remember, though the past may be a foreign country, its lessons still have much to teach us about who we are and what we might yet become. Good night. Content warning. This script contains descriptions of historical violence and persecution that some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Part 3. The Medieval Inquisition takes shape. Picture yourself in the grand halls of the Lateran Palace in Rome. It's the year 1215, and the air is thick with incense and a sense of momentous change. Pope Innocent III has just wrapped up the Fourth Lateran Council, where he issued decrees to reform the Church and combat the rising tide of heresy. One of the most fateful decisions made at that council was declaring the Albigensian Crusade, a military campaign to wipe out a heretical sect known as the Cathars. The Cathars, concentrated in the Languedoc region of southern France, held some radically different beliefs from Orthodox Catholicism. They believed in a dualistic universe, where the material world was created by an evil god, and the spiritual realm by a good god. They rejected the authority of the church hierarchy and the sacraments, instead venerating their own spiritual leaders, known as perfects. Pope Innocent saw the Cathars as a serious threat to the Church's unity and power. He called on the King of France and local nobles to take up arms against the Cathars, promising them the same spiritual rewards granted to crusaders in the Holy Land. The resulting Albigensian Crusade, which kicked off in 1209, was less a traditional crusade than a brutal war of conquest waged by northern French nobles against their southern counterparts. Armies swept through the verdant hills and vineyards of Languedoc, laying siege to the magnificent walled city of Carcassonne and other strongholds. When the city of Béziers fell to the Crusaders in July 1209, soldiers asked their commander how to tell faithful Catholics from heretic Cathars. The reply came, "Kill them all. God will know his own." In the ensuing massacre, up to 20,000 men, women and children were slaughtered. The Albigensian Crusade succeeded in dismantling the Cathar heresy, but at a terrible cost. The rich culture and relative tolerance of Languedoc was snuffed out, and the region was annexed into the Kingdom of France. The Crusade set a grim precedent that heresy could be wiped out through sheer military force. It was a turning point that set the stage for the formalized Inquisitions to come. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place in 1231, when Pope Gregory IX established the Papal Inquisition. Gregory appointed a special class of theologians and canon lawyers, drawn from the Dominican order, to act as official inquisitors. Their mission? To find and interrogate suspected heretics, using torture, if needed, to extract confessions. One of the most notorious inquisitors of this era was Bernard Goy, who zealously pursued heretics in the early 14th century. Goy wrote a famous handbook for inquisitors called the Practica Inquisitionis, which laid out in exacting detail how to question suspects and evaluate their guilt or innocence. Women in particular fell under suspicion, as they were seen as especially susceptible to heretical and demonic influence. Guy's manual would be widely copied and distributed, becoming a standard reference for inquisitors across Europe. With the launch of the Albigensian Crusade and the Papal Inquisition, the Church now had potent tools to enforce orthodoxy, military might, and a legal apparatus to investigate suspected heretics. In our next chapter, we'll zoom in and examine the actual process of a medieval inquisition, from the initial accusations to the final punishments. We'll see how this process, while ostensibly designed to reconcile wayward souls with the Church, more often devolved into a nightmare of torture, forced confessions, and fiery executions. But for now, let the sounds of clashing swords and marching crusaders fade away as we drift into the mists of time and sleep. Part 4. Inside the Inquisition process. The soft crackle of a quill pen on parchment, the laboured breathing of a prisoner deep in a dungeon cell, the whispered Latin prayers of a priest. These are the sounds of a medieval inquisition in progress. We often imagine inquisitions as a sort of 15th century trial by jury, with evidence presented and arguments made. But the reality was far more one-sided and weighted towards presuming guilt. In truth, once accused of heresy, it was very difficult to escape punishment, as the inquisitor was both prosecutor and judge. The process usually began with denunciations from local informants and spies, who were incentivized to report any suspicious activity to the church authorities. Inquisitors would arrive in a town, announce an edict of grace offering leniency who confessed, and begin investigating. Those formerly accused of heresy would be brought before the inquisitor for questioning. These interrogations could last for hours, with inquisitors using trickery, leading questions, and threats to elicit confessions. Inquisitors were trained in the art of casuistry, using rhetorical techniques to trap the suspect in logical contradictions. If an accused heretic refused to confess, torture was often the next step. Though initially prohibited by the Church, Pope Innocent IV formally sanctioned the use of torture in 1252, arguing it was a necessary tool to obtain the truth. Torture methods were agonizing and psychologically devastating. victims might be stretched on the rack, hung by their wrists with weights on their feet, forced to ingest and expel vast quantities of water, or burned with red-hot irons. The goal of torture was to extract a confession, evidence of true repentance, and the names of other heretics. The only ways to avoid torture were to recant one's heretical beliefs and accept penance, or convince the inquisitors of one's innocence, an almost impossible task. Punishments for those convicted ranged from mild to severe. On the softer side, a repentant heretic might be required to wear a yellow cross on their clothing, go on pilgrimage, or pay a hefty fine. More serious offenders would face imprisonment, sometimes for life, in grim monastic cells. The worst punishment was death at the stake, a sentence borne by unrepentant heretics and those who had relapsed into heresy after renouncing it. Though inquisitors pronounced sentences, they did not carry them out directly. Those convicted were handed over to secular authorities for punishment, allowing the church to keep its hands clean while still using the threat of state violence. This practice was graphically summed up by the catchphrase, "The church detests bloodshed," a darkly ironic statement given the blood spilled by the Inquisitions. We can get a first-hand glimpse into the terror and tragedy of the inquisitorial process through the story of a man named Menocchio. He was an Italian miller from the village of Montereale, who was investigated by the Roman Inquisition in the late 16th century. Menocchio was an oddball by the standards of his time, an irreverent individualist who was skeptical of church doctrine and drew his own theological conclusions from the books he read. Word of his unorthodox ideas reached the inquisitors, including his notion that the world formed from chaos like cheese coagulating in milk, and that Jesus was just a man who did tricks to impress his followers. In court transcripts, we can hear Menocchio's folksy voice protesting his innocence, insisting that he was a good Christian who meant no harm. But this defense held no water with inquisitors who saw his beliefs as dangerous heresies. After a lengthy trial and torture, Menocchio was finally declared an unrepentant heretic and burned at the stake in 1599. Menocchio's tale is a sobering reminder of how little tolerance there was for difference and dissent in medieval times. Through the brutal machinery of the Inquisition, anyone who strayed from orthodoxy, purposefully or accidentally, risked social ruin, imprisonment, and a horrific death. From these dark origins in the 13th century, the flames of the medieval Inquisitions would spread across Europe and reach new heights of ruthless efficiency and paranoid suspicion. Next time, we'll track the growth of the Inquisitions into a continent-spanning patchwork of heretic hunters, from the rocky hills of southern France to the bustling streets of Spanish cities. Until then, rest a while in a world free from the Inquisitors' omnipresent gaze. We left off with the story of Johannes Junius, one of the many victims swept up in the cruel machinery of the medieval witch trials that gripped Europe in the 15th through 17th centuries. Johannes was an elderly and well-respected burgomaster in the German city of Bamberg. In 1628, at the age of 55, he was accused of witchcraft by a maid under torture. Despite his protestations of innocence, Johannes was himself brutally tortured by the zealous witch hunters. Stretched on the rack, Johannes had heavy weights hung from his feet, as the inquisitors demanded he confess to attending a witch's Sabbath and renouncing God. When he refused to confess to these fabricated charges, they splashed him with scalding hot water and carved pieces of flesh from his back. Finally, faced with the threat of even worse torments, Johannes broke down and confessed to everything the torturers wanted to hear. But on the eve of his scheduled execution, Johannes managed to secretly smuggle a letter out of his dungeon cell with the help of his jailkeeper. In shaky handwriting, perhaps scrawled in the dark, Johannes wrote to his daughter, Veronica. "Innocent I came to jail. Innocent I was tortured. Innocent I must die," he lamented. For whoever comes into the witch prison, must become a witch or be tortured until he invents something out of his head. As I did. Johannes's tragic letter is a first-hand account of the terror and injustice faced by those accused of heresy and witchcraft in medieval times. Across Europe, some 200,000 people, most of them women, were tortured and killed in the witch hunts between the 15th and 18th centuries. These horrific persecutions were motivated by a combination of religious zealotry, paranoid superstition, and misogyny. The medieval worldview held that witches gained their powers by making pacts with the devil. It was believed that they flew through the air, shapeshifted into animals, caused crop failures and sickness, and engaged in evil sabbaths to worship Satan. None of it was true, of course. But try telling that to the inquisitors and judges steeped in a worldview of God's cosmic battle against the forces of hell. Armed with handbooks, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, that instructed them on how to spot a witch based on shaky evidence, like birthmarks or reaction to holy water. These witch hunters were determined to purge their communities of demonic corruption. A typical witch trial began with accusations from neighbors. Any unusual or disliked person was vulnerable, especially older unmarried women. The accusations often came from others who were themselves being tortured. An intense interrogation by the inquisitors would follow, often involving a humiliating body search for a devil's mark, some blemish that supposedly proved their pact with Satan. Then came the infamous tests for witchcraft. In one cruel test, the accused would be stripped naked, bound at the hands and feet, and tossed into a lake or river. If she sank, she was declared innocent, but often drowned. If she floated, it was a sure sign of guilt. Failing these tests, the accused would be tortured on stretching racks with thumb screws and vices, pricked with bodkins to find insensitive witch spots, and hideously more. Even the strongest would break under such excruciating pain and confess to anything. The trial records are filled with outlandish confessions clearly made under duress and possibly mental breakdown. Finally, those found guilty of witchcraft, which was nearly everyone accused, were sentenced to a grim public execution, most commonly burning at the stake. The lucky ones were killed beforehand, perhaps strangled or hanged, but many were burned alive for the alleged crime of making a diabolical pact. Across Europe, the pyres burned with the writhing bodies of heretics. One of the cruelest tricks of the witch persecutions is how they forced the accused to conform to expectations. Under unimaginable torture, these innocent victims were compelled to confess to exactly the lurid crimes their tormentors imagined. In their final moments, they were pressured to affirm the truth of the accusations, perpetuating the mythology of satanic witchcraft. As one victim cried out while being led to the stake, "Now I'm a witch, but I wasn't before." So perished Johannes Junius and countless other victims of the witch trials, their confessions extracted under extreme torture, taken as certain proof of their supposed crimes. These horrific persecutions, fueled by the cruel machinery of the Inquisition and the superstitious medieval dread of heresy and witchcraft, destroyed the lives of countless innocents between the 15th and 18th centuries. But even as suspected witches and heretics burned across Europe, the tides were slowly turning. The iron grip of the medieval church was being pried loose by transformative events. In 1517, a little-known German monk and professor named Martin Luther launched an earthquake that would shake Christendom to its foundations. Incensed by the church practice of selling indulgences, essentially get-out-of-purgatory free cards, Luther penned a fiery condemnation titled The 95 Theses. In an act of legendary defiance, he nailed this document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, airing his grievances directly to the Archbishop of Mainz. What happened next would split the church and trigger centuries of bloody conflict. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Almost overnight, Luther became the most famous and reviled figure in Europe. To his many followers, Luther was a bold reformer who exposed the Church's corruption and championed a more direct relationship with God, not controlled by popes and priests. But to the Church orthodoxy, Martin Luther was public heretic number one. For daring to question papal authority and the Church's monopoly on interpreting Scripture, Luther was condemned as an arch-heretic and excommunicated by Pope Leo VI in 1521. The Edict of Worms, issued by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, branded Luther an outlaw and heretic to be captured and delivered for punishment. Luther managed to escape arrest, whisked away by his supporters, and given secret sanctuary in Wartburg Castle. There, he set about translating the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into German, giving lay people unprecedented direct access to the Word of God. Meanwhile, Luther's radical ideas spread like wildfire, fanned by the power of the newly invented printing press. Lutheranism gained official footing as the state religion in a number of German principalities and Scandinavia. Other Protestant offshoots like Calvinism, Anabaptism, and Anglicanism soon followed. For the first time in a millennium, the Catholic Church had its absolute authority openly defied and its territory splintered. The Church did not take these existential threats lightly. In the view of the popes and prelates, Protestants were not just heretics, they were apostates who abandoned the true faith entirely. The Council of Trent in 1545 launched the Counter-Reformation, affirming traditional Catholic doctrines and condemning what it called the heresies of the Protestants. The Roman Inquisition was deployed to stamp out the spread of Protestantism throughout Catholic domains. As the Reformation and Counter-Reformation gathered steam, Europe was plunged into some of the bloodiest sectarian conflicts in history. In France, decades of strife between Catholics and Protestants, called the Huguenots, culminated in the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when Catholic mobs slaughtered thousands of Huguenots in the streets of Paris. Beginning in 1618, the 30 Years' War engulfed much of Central Europe, pitting Protestant and Catholic states against each other. It's estimated up to 8 million perished from the fighting, famine, and disease, making it one of the deadliest wars in European history. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia finally ended the war's carnage and enshrined limited religious toleration. But persecution of Protestants as heretics continued well into the 1700s in the Papal States and other staunchly Catholic regions. Yet as Europe was tearing itself apart in a spasm of religious violence, new intellectual currents were stirring that would finally break the chokehold of dogmatism and orthodoxy. The scientific revolution, spearheaded by geniuses like Galileo and Newton, began substituting rigorous evidence-based inquiry for church doctrine as the lodestar for truth about the world. The Age of Enlightenment dawned in the 18th century, championing individual liberty and freedom of conscience. Revolutionary documents like the US Bill of Rights enshrined religious freedom as a cornerstone human right. The last vestiges of heresy laws crumbled away, starting with the final execution for heresy in Britain in 1612, and France abolishing the crime in 1791 after the Revolution. Thus, the medieval obsession with rooting out heresy as the ultimate thought crime finally ebbed away. The notion that someone could be imprisoned, tortured, and executed simply for their privately held religious beliefs became unthinkable. Heresy lost its power as the eternal bogeyman threatening civilization, as modernity embraced the Enlightenment ideals of tolerance, pluralism, and individual liberty. Looking back across the centuries, the cruel fates of so-called medieval heretics, whether Cathars, Jews, or accused witches, stand as a warning about the dangers of persecuting those who dare to dissent. While almost incomprehensible to our modern minds, these horrific campaigns against heretics arose from the medieval conviction that a single religious truth must be defended at all costs. Any deviation or dissent threatened to unravel the very fabric of society and imperil immortal souls. But those who suffered and perished for their beliefs helped light the way to a more tolerant world. These martyrs to the cause of freedom of conscience loosened the stranglehold of groupthink and orthodoxy. Their stories whisper to us down through the ages, urging us to fiercely protect the right of each person to seek their own truth. The condemned heretics and tortured witches of medieval times can finally rest in peace, knowing the flames of the pyres and stakes have long grown cold. The terror of the Inquisitor's chambers and the despair of the dungeon no longer threaten those who dare to believe differently. The light of reason and freedom has dispelled the shadow of heresy, and we are all the safer and freer for it. And with that, our journey through the dark and haunted landscape of medieval heresy comes to an end. I hope you found this tour through a tumultuous chapter in history fascinating, if rather unsettling. The cries of the condemned and the cruel instruments of Inquisition have faded into the past, but their echoes still remind us of the eternal value of tolerance. Sweet dreams and good night. The Fraticelli, or spiritual Franciscans, were a group within the Franciscan order who took an uncompromisingly strict view of apostolic poverty. They believed that the mainstream Franciscan order had strayed too far from the original ideals of their founder, St. Francis of Assisi, who had preached absolute poverty and renunciation of property. In 1317, Pope John XXII condemned the Fraticelli as heretics in a papal bull, accusing them of disobedience and defiance of church authority. The stage was set for a sweeping persecution of these dissenting friars. Inquisitors hunted down Fraticelli throughout Italy, southern France, and even parts of Germany and England. The Franciscan friars, Fra Michele of Calzi and Fra Bartolomeo of Buggiano, were burned at the stake in Florence in 1389. Many other Fraticelli would meet the same grim fate for refusing to renounce their beliefs in the face of ecclesiastical pressure. Meanwhile, the image of the heretic increasingly blended with that of the witch in the late medieval mind. Accused witches, mostly women, were put on trial by both secular and ecclesiastical courts on charges of diabolism, malevolent sorcery, and destruction of crops. A typical witch trial would begin with an accusation, often arising from rumors, gossip, or personal vendettas within a community. The accused witch would then be arrested and interrogated, often with the use of torture to extract a confession. Inquisitors and judges employed various methods to test for witchcraft. The infamous swimming test involved tying up the accused and throwing her into water to see if she would float, which was taken as a sure sign of guilt. Witch prickers were brought in to poke the accused with special needles, searching for an insensitive devil's mark. Under duress and agony, it's little wonder that so many innocent people confess to fantastical crimes and condemn themselves in the process. The letter of Johannes Junius, mayor of Bamberg, Germany, and victim of the brutal Bamberg witch trials of 1628, offers a heartbreaking glimpse into the human toll of such proceedings. Writing secretly from prison to his daughter, Junius described the excruciating tortures he had endured: thumbscrews, leg screws, strappado, and more. When at last the executioner led me back into the prison, he said to me, "Sir, I beg you, for God's sake, confess something, whether it be true or not," Junius recounted. Despite insisting on his innocence, Junius was burned at the stake. The persecution of supposed witches as heretics would claim tens of thousands of lives, the majority in the German-speaking parts of Europe. An estimated 45,000 to 60,000 people, roughly 75 to 80% of them women, would be executed for witchcraft between 1450 and 1750. But while witch trials captured the late medieval and early modern imagination, the Catholic Church soon found itself facing a much more serious threat to its authority: the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, an Augustinian friar named Martin Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, decrying the sale of indulgences and calling for a debate on church reform. Luther's ideas spread like wildfire thanks to the printing press, sparking the Protestant Reformation. Faced with this unprecedented challenge, the Catholic Church lashed out against Protestantism with all the tools of anti-heresy it had honed over centuries. Luther himself was excommunicated as a heretic in 1521 by Pope Leo X. Protestant reformers and their followers faced imprisonment, torture, and execution across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. In England, the devoutly Catholic Queen Mary I, who reigned from 1553 to 1558, earned the moniker Bloody Mary for her ruthless persecution of Protestants. Nearly 300 Protestant heretics, from lowly craftsmen to influential bishops like Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, were burned at the stake. The era of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation marked the last great flourishing of heresy hunting in Europe. The Catholic Church's monopoly on defining orthodoxy had been definitively broken. Exhausted by the seemingly endless religious conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries, European societies slowly began to question the necessity and wisdom of persecuting religious dissenters. The scientific and intellectual revolutions of the 17th century accelerated this change. Astronomers like Galileo Galilei, tried by the Roman Inquisition for the heresy of heliocentrism, raised troubling questions about church doctrine and authority. Philosophers of the Enlightenment like John Locke argued for religious tolerance as a natural right. The last person to be executed for heresy in Britain was Edward Whiteman, an English Baptist burned at the stake in 1612 for his unorthodox views on the Trinity and soul sleep. Though the crime of heresy remained on the books, such punishments became increasingly rare. In 1677, Britain finally abolished the death penalty for heresy. As we've seen, the persecution of heretics arose out of a medieval worldview that saw religious uniformity as essential to social and cosmic order. Any deviation, however slight, was perceived as a threat that had to be violently extinguished, lest it spread and unravel the very fabric of Christian society. Though this mindset may seem utterly alien to us today, we can strive to understand it in the context of the times. Medieval people, from peasants to popes, lived in a world suffused with the sacred, where spiritual and temporal power were deeply intertwined. Heresy represented a terrifying rupture in an otherwise eternal and unchanging order. The story of how heretics were treated in medieval times is thus, in many ways, the story of how our notions of dissent and difference have evolved. The idea that an individual could hold beliefs that diverged from the dominant orthodoxy and not be punished for them is, in the broad sweep of human history, a relatively recent development. From the Cathars to Martin Luther, medieval heretics risked everything to challenge religious authorities and stand up for their convictions. While their fates were often tragic, we can still recognize their sacrifices as a part of the long and ongoing human struggle for freedom of thought and conscience. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us dream of a world that continues to grow in tolerance and understanding. As the trials of Johannes Junius faded into history, the flames of the Reformation began spreading like wildfire across Europe in the early 16th century. It all started with an earnest monk named Martin Luther, who had no idea he was about to shake the very foundations of Christendom. Luther was deeply troubled by the corruption he saw in the Catholic Church, especially the selling of indulgences, essentially get-out-of-purgatory-free cards that clergy hawked to the faithful. He felt this perverted the whole idea of repentance and salvation. So in an act of academic protest, Luther wrote up a list of 95 criticisms against indulgences and other church practices. According to legend, on October 31st, 1517, he boldly nailed this 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, which acted as a kind of community bulletin board. Luther hadn't set out to split the church. He genuinely wanted to spur reform from within. But his provocative ideas spread quickly thanks to the recent invention of the printing press. Soon all sorts of people, from peasants to princes, were latching onto his teachings that salvation came through faith alone, not the church's rituals, and that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate spiritual authority. The Protestant Reformation had begun in earnest. The Catholic hierarchy, of course, was not about to take this lying down. In 1521, Luther was summoned before the Diet of Worms, an assembly of church and civil authorities, and ordered to renounce his heretical teachings. But he refused, declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other." The church promptly issued the Edict of Worms, labeling Luther an outlaw and a heretic. But by this point, the Reformation had taken on a life of its own. Reformers like John Calvin in France and Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland put their own spin on Luther's ideas, spawning new Protestant denominations. In England, King Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church over his desire to divorce his wife, establishing the Anglican Church. Across the Holy Roman Empire, various princes and cities embraced Protestantism, often more for political than theological reasons. The Catholic Church responded with its typical zeal in targeting new heresies. Scores of Protestants were tried, imprisoned, and executed by the Inquisition throughout the 16th century. In France, the infamous Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 saw mobs of Catholics murder thousands of Protestants known as Huguenots in the streets of Paris. The Church also launched its own internal reforms in the Counter-Reformation, seeking to correct the corruption and abuses that Luther had railed against. But by the mid-17th century, Europeans had largely grown weary of religious conflict. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War and enshrined a policy of religious tolerance. Each ruler could still choose their state religion, but had to allow minorities to practice their own faiths in peace. This marked a major turning point for heretics. While still denounced and discriminated against, they were no longer officially tortured and killed with the same fanatical fervour as in medieval times. The very last execution for heresy in Britain, for example, was that of Edward Whiteman, an English Baptist preacher with unorthodox views on the Trinity and soul sleep. He was burned at the stake in 1612, under King James I. The last person to be hanged for blasphemy was Thomas Aikenhead in Scotland in 1697. In the coming decades, the Enlightenment philosophies of religious tolerance and freedom of conscience would make the crime of heresy virtually unthinkable to the modern mind. Looking back from our vantage point today, the medieval persecution of heretics seems shocking and horrific. How could people who devoutly believed in a loving God act with such cruelty against their fellow man? But we have to understand it in the context of a world where the church was the center of society and eternal salvation was on the line. To medieval folk, heresy wasn't just an attack on the church, but on the very fabric of civilization. When we see someone like Menocchio, the inquisitive Italian miller, defending his unconventional beliefs before the Inquisition, he seems like a hero daring to speak truth to power. But to his judges, he was an infuriating gadfly threatening to unravel the tapestry of God's universe with his strange ideas. They felt an enormous pressure to stamp out the infection of heresy before it could spread and doom more souls to perdition. In a world without religious pluralism or the scientific method, enforcing orthodoxy through inquisition and punishment was simply how one dealt with dangerous ideas. The fact that it produced such miscarriages of justice and brutal abuses of power looks inevitable in hindsight. One shudders to imagine being an average Johannes, terrified you'll be denounced as a heretic and tortured into confessing thought crimes you're not even sure you committed. We can take some solace in the fact that, as bloody and painful as it was, this tragic chapter in history did eventually give rise to our modern notions of religious liberty and freedom of speech. Every martyr and dissenter who stood up for their convictions, from Jan Hus to Martin Luther, to the many nameless victims of the Inquisition, helped plant the seeds of a world where one could question authority without fear of being labelled a heretic. So let us remember the Cathars and the Waldensians, the Lollards and the Protestants, the witches and the blasphemers, not as dangerous heretics who deserved what they got, but as human beings who suffered and sacrificed for daring to believe something different. In honouring their memory, we recommit ourselves to building a society of free inquiry and peaceful pluralism, where no one need fear the knock of the Inquisitor at their door. As the Inquisition spread its reach across medieval Europe, the flames of intolerance grew ever higher. From the sun-drenched hills of Spain to the misty moors of England, those who dared to question the authority of the Church found themselves in the crosshairs of a powerful and unforgiving institution. Under the reign of the notorious Spanish Inquisitor General Tomás de Torquemada, thousands of conversos and moriscos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, were targeted as heretics. Suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths, these unfortunate souls were subjected to brutal interrogations, torture, and even death at the hands of Torquemada's zealous inquisitors. The Spanish Inquisition became a byword for cruelty and fanaticism, striking fear into the hearts of all who lived under its shadow. Across Europe, similar scenes played out as papal inquisitors hunted down anyone who strayed from the narrow path of orthodoxy. Scholars estimate that between the 13th and 19th centuries, medieval inquisitions across Europe tried over 100,000 individuals for heresy, with anywhere from 10 to 20% of those trials resulting in execution, most often by burning at the stake. But even as the Inquisition tightened its grip, there were still brave souls who dared to challenge the Church's authority. In England, a humble parish priest named John Wycliffe began to question the corruption and worldliness he saw among the clergy. Wycliffe argued that the Bible, not the Pope, should be the ultimate source of spiritual authority, and he worked to translate the scriptures from Latin into English so that common people could read them for themselves. Wycliffe's ideas spread like wildfire, attracting a devoted following known as the Lollards. But the Church would not tolerate such defiance. After Wycliffe's death in 1384, his bones were dug up, burned, and scattered in the river as a warning to others. In the early 15th century, the Lollards faced intense persecution, with many meeting a fiery end for the crime of heresy. A similar fate befell the Czech reformer Jan Hus, who dared to preach against the excesses and abuses of the Church. Hus was a gifted orator, and his sermons calling for renewal and reform attracted huge crowds in Prague. But his enemies in the Church would not be silenced. In 1415, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance to face charges of heresy. Despite being promised safe conduct, he was arrested, tried, and sentenced to burn at the stake. As the flames consumed his body, Hus cried out, "O God, do not hold this sin against them." The Inquisition cast a long and terrifying shadow across medieval Europe, but its reach did not stop at the borders of Christendom. In the feverish atmosphere of the times, any hint of deviation from the norm could arouse suspicion. And so, alongside the hunts for heretics and reformers, there arose another terrible phenomenon, the witch trials. In the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, a mania for rooting out supposed witches swept through Europe like a plague. Across the continent, countless innocent women, and some men, found themselves accused of practicing dark magic and conspiring with the devil. A whispered rumor, a chance misfortune, a mysterious illness, anything could lead to an accusation of witchcraft. And once accused, there was often no escape. The trials themselves were a cruel mockery of justice. Suspects were subjected to barbaric tests and ordeals, from being weighed against a stack of Bibles to having their skin pricked for devil's marks. Under torture, many confessed to impossible crimes, sealing their own fates. Most were condemned to death, hanged, beheaded, or burned alive at the stake. Among the most notorious witch trials were those that took place in the German city of Bamberg in the 1620s. Over the course of just a few years, hundreds of people were arrested, tortured, and put to death on flimsy charges. One of the victims was Johannes Junius, a well-respected burgomaster who was accused by a beggar woman of practicing sorcery. From his prison cell, Johannes managed to smuggle out a secret letter to his daughter, written in a shaky hand on a scrap of paper. In it, he proclaimed his innocence and described the horrific tortures he had endured. "Many 100,000 good nights, dearly beloved daughter Veronica," he wrote. "Innocent I came into prison. Innocent have I been tortured. Innocent I must die, in this dungeon, from which without the will of God I can scarcely hope to come out alive." Johannes's letter is a haunting reminder of the human toll of the witch hunts which claimed tens of thousands of lives across Europe. But as the frenzy reached its peak, the seeds of change were already being sown. For even as the Inquisition and the witch trials raged, new ideas were beginning to take root, ideas that would challenge the Church's monopoly on truth and transform the Western world forever. In the early 16th century, a little-known German monk named Martin Luther began to question the teachings and practices of the Catholic Church. Outraged by the sale of indulgences, essentially get-out-of-purgatory-free cards, Luther nailed a list of 95 theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, sparking the Protestant Reformation and throwing all of Europe into turmoil. Luther's ideas spread rapidly thanks to the power of the printing press, and soon other reformers like John Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli were challenging church doctrine and calling for a return to the pure teachings of Scripture. In response, the Catholic Church doubled down, denouncing Protestantism as heresy and unleashing a new wave of persecution against those who embraced the new faith. In England, Queen Mary I, known to history as Bloody Mary, tried to stamp out Protestantism by burning hundreds of dissenters at the stake. Across Europe, wars of religion erupted as Catholic and Protestant armies clashed in a struggle for the soul of Christendom. The persecution of heretics had reached a fever pitch, but the cracks were beginning to show in the edifice of the Church's power. Slowly but surely, the tides began to turn. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries gave rise to a new way of understanding the world, based on observation, experimentation, and reason rather than blind faith. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century challenged traditional sources of authority and championed individual liberty and freedom of thought. And as new ideas and discoveries poured in from around the globe, Europeans began to question the absolute truths they had once taken for granted. The last execution for heresy in Britain took place in 1612, when a Unitarian minister named Edward Whiteman was burned at the stake in Lichfield. But by then, the practice was already falling out of favour. In 1677, the crime of heresy was formally abolished in Britain, though it would take much longer for true religious tolerance to take hold. As we look back on the dark history of heretic persecutions in medieval Europe, it's easy to feel a sense of revulsion and horror at the cruelty and intolerance of the times. But it's important to remember that for the people of that era, heresy was not just a matter of personal belief. It was a threat to the very fabric of society, a challenge to the divinely ordained order that held their world together. In a time when the Church was the ultimate source of knowledge and authority, to question its teachings was to risk not just one's own soul, but the stability and security of the entire community. Heretics were seen as dangerous subversives, agents of chaos and disorder who had to be rooted out and destroyed for the greater good. Of course, this worldview was ultimately unsustainable, as new ideas and discoveries chipped away at the foundations of medieval thought. The old certainties began to crumble. The Protestant Reformation shattered the unity of Christendom, while the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment undermined the Church's claims to absolute truth. Today, we live in a world where freedom of conscience is enshrined as a fundamental human right, where individuals are free to believe as they choose without fear of persecution or punishment. But the story of heresy in medieval Europe reminds us of the long and difficult struggle that led us to this point, and of the dangers that arise when any one institution or ideology claims a monopoly on truth. As we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with images of a distant and often brutal past, perhaps we can find some comfort in the knowledge that change is always possible, that even the most entrenched beliefs and structures can be challenged and transformed by the power of the human spirit. And perhaps, in our dreams, we can imagine a world where all people are free to follow their own paths to truth, without fear of the flames of intolerance. The horrors inflicted upon those condemned as heretics in medieval times are difficult for us to fathom today. Yet to fully grasp how such brutal persecution could occur, we must step back into the world of medieval Christendom. It was a world steeped in superstition and fear, where religious devotion permeated every aspect of life. A world where salvation was seen as the highest goal, and anything perceived as a threat to that salvation had to be rooted out at all costs. This was the unquestioned reality for medieval men and women. Peasants toiling in the fields, merchants hawking their wares, lords presiding over sprawling fiefdoms. They lived and died secure in the knowledge that the Catholic Church held the keys to heaven and hell. To stray from the Church's teachings was to imperil one's eternal soul. And so, when courageous thinkers and preachers began to question Church doctrine and authority, it triggered a response that was as vicious as it was implacable. One cannot explore the depths of medieval heretic persecutions without shining a light on the Spanish Inquisition. Though initially established to maintain Catholic orthodoxy, it soon took on a terrifyingly singular focus under the reign of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile in the late 15th century. As Spain unified and the Reconquista drove out the last of the Muslim Moors from the Iberian Peninsula, religious fervour reached a fever pitch. The monarchs, ever zealous defenders of the faith, saw an opportunity to consolidate their power and cleanse their kingdom of all hints of heresy. Their most notorious agent in this quest was Tomás de Torquemada, a Dominican friar appointed as the first Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition in 1483. A man of unwavering fanaticism, Torquemada brought the full force of inquisitorial might down upon any and all suspected heretics in Spain. He drafted the infamous Instructions for the Inquisitors, a manual detailing brutal interrogation methods to extract confessions, including torture and the threat of burning at the stake. Two groups found themselves squarely in Torquemada's crosshairs, the Conversos and the Moriscos. Conversos were Jews who had converted to Christianity, often forcibly, while Moriscos were Muslims who had undergone the same coerced conversions. Despite outwardly practicing Catholicism, many secretly continued their former faiths, observing Shabbat, abstaining from pork, even holding clandestine synagogues in their homes. To Torquemada and his fanatical inquisitors, these false converts represented an existential threat to Spain's religious purity and had to be dealt with decisively. No one was safe from the Spanish Inquisition's rapacious tentacles. Armed with Torquemada's inquisitorial guidelines and utter certitude of purpose, inquisitors fanned out across the kingdom to root out heresy and punish those who strayed from the Catholic faith. Informants and spies were everywhere, from palace courts to humble villages. eager to denounce their neighbours for the slightest hint of impiety. The accused would be hauled in front of a tribunal court, often with little warning or explanation, and subjected to intense questioning designed to elicit a confession by any means necessary. Those who refused to confess, maintaining their innocence in the face of their accusers, faced an even darker fate. The Spanish Inquisition was infamous for its use of brutal torture methods to extract confessions and names of accomplices. Victims would be stretched on racks until their limbs were ripped from their sockets. Stripped naked and bound, they'd be suspended by their wrists for hours, weights attached to their ankles to intensify the agony. Inquisitors would administer bone-crushing compression torture with special chairs and iron visors. When all else failed, the dreaded strappado would be employed, dislocating shoulders as victims were repeatedly dropped from a height with a jerk. Many could not withstand these horrific torments and would eventually confess to whatever the inquisitors demanded of them. They would be paraded out into the town square, wearing black robes painted with hellish scenes, a pointed hat of shame atop their heads. After a public spectacle of penance and humiliation, most would be imprisoned in dank dungeons or sent on ruinous pilgrimages. The lucky ones would escape with their lives, but for an unfortunate number, totaling in the thousands over the course of Torquemada's notorious tenure, public penance wasn't enough to erase the stain of their supposed sins. Their fate would be proclaimed by inquisitors with ruthless finality. Death by burning at the stake. The Catholic monarchs sometimes attended these acts of faith in person, as much an exercise in royal authority as religious purification. Onlookers would gather to watch the grisly ritual, the victims' agonizing screams filling the air along with the acrid stench of charred flesh. It was a depraved spectacle meant to imprint an undeniable message. The wages of heresy is suffering beyond imagining. As the Spanish Inquisition metastasized into a monstrous labyrinthine bureaucracy under Torquemada, with tribunals in cities across Spain, reams of obsessive documentation, and an ever-widening paranoid dragnet, untold lives were consumed in the clashing gears of religious intolerance and state control. Estimates vary, but the most recent scholarship holds that under Torquemada's reign from 1483 to 1498, the Spanish Inquisition tried around 100,000 individuals. Of that number, as many as 2,000 were likely executed, burned alive at the stake for the crime of heresy against the one true faith. The psychic scars inflicted by this institutionalized campaign of terror, torture, and murder would linger over Spain for generations to come, an enduring blight on the nation's history remembered to this day. The same ugliness born of misguided fear and fanaticism would rear its head time and again, even into our modern age, during the Salem witch trials, in Soviet gulags, under Pol Pot's murderous regime. The names and faces may change. The core inhumanity remains constant. For those poor souls condemned as heretics and obliterated so cruelly at the hands of Torquemada's Spanish Inquisition, we who abide in more enlightened times can offer only our solemn remembrance and steadfast commitment to ensuring such senseless barbarity is never again unleashed in the name of eradicating dissent. The heretical thinkers who dared to question stale orthodoxies in ages past, often at the cost of their own lives, helped pave the way for our modern ideas of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and human rights. We stand on their shoulders, however unwittingly, and bear witness to their incalculable sacrifices. By grappling with the grim spectre of the medieval heretic persecutions, we affirm that most sacred commandment: never forget. The practice of burning heretics at the stake would continue well into the 16th century, as the Protestant Reformation created new religious divisions across Europe. In 1553, a young Spanish theologian named Michael Servetus was burned alive in Geneva on the orders of John Calvin, the influential Protestant reformer. Servetus's crime was denying the Trinity and infant baptism in his theological writings, views considered heretical by both Protestant and Catholic authorities. As he was led to the stake, Servetus is said to have cried out, "Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me," a final plea that confirmed his unorthodox beliefs about the nature of Christ in the eyes of his executioners. The reign of England's Queen Mary IV from 1553 to 1558 saw a brutal campaign against Protestants in which around 300 men and women were burned as heretics in an attempt to restore Catholic worship. One of the most famous martyrs of this period was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had played a key role in the English Reformation under Henry VIII. In a show trial orchestrated by Catholic officials, Cranmer was forced to watch his Protestant colleagues burn at the stake. Under threat of a similar fate, he signed a series of recantations rejecting Protestant theology. Yet in a final act of defiance, as the flames were lit around him, Cranmer thrust his right hand into the fire, declaring it should burn first for signing those false confessions against his conscience. These grim spectacles of public heretic burnings served as a form of religious propaganda, a warning to the populace of the dangers of straying from orthodox belief. The condemned were often required to wear a penitential garment called a San Benito, adorned with hellish imagery of demons and flames. A carrozo, a pointed cap, would mockingly adorn their heads. Execution day would begin with a Catholic Mass, followed by a public procession where the sentenced heretics were paraded through the streets and jeered by the crowds. After a final chance to repent and accept their last rites, those who remained steadfast in their heretical views would be tied to a stake atop a pile of wood. Sticks were wedged under their chins to keep their heads upright. Sulfur and gunpowder were sometimes added to the tinder to speed the burning. As the flames consumed them, their agonized screams pierced the air. The scent of charred flesh spread over the gathered throngs, a sensory warning to all who might dare question the authority of the Church. While the religious wars sparked by the Protestant Reformation raged across Europe, the Inquisition expanded its targets beyond accused heretics to another maligned group: witches. The late 15th century saw the publication of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, a lurid manual for identifying, interrogating, and convicting those suspected of witchcraft. Its authors, the German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, claimed that witches gained their dark powers by making a pact with Satan and could use them to curse crops, conjure storms, possess victims, even transform into animals. As fantastical accusations of witchcraft spread like a fever over the 16th and 17th centuries, scores of women and men, especially social outcasts and the poor, were rounded up to face terrifying trials. Accused witches were subjected to painful ordeals to prove their guilt or innocence. One notorious method was swimming the witch. The suspect's wrists and ankles would be tied together, then they would be tossed into a body of water. If they sank, and often drowned, they were deemed innocent. But if they floated to the surface, it was seen as proof that the water, symbolizing baptism, was rejecting them due to their alliance with Satan. Other brutal tests included pricking moles or skin imperfections with needles to find the devil's mark, an insensitive spot that didn't bleed. Those who confessed, often after horrific torture on racks and strappado devices that dislocated limbs, faced public execution, most commonly by burning at the stake. The German city of Würzburg saw the immolation of 160 women and children during a series of witch trials between 1626 to 1631. In Scotland, an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 people were tried for witchcraft in the 16th and 17th centuries, with around 2,500 executed, often by strangulation before their bodies were burned. This fevered pursuit of alleged witches, so often the most vulnerable members of society, stands as a chilling example of what could happen when religious superstition and paranoia overtook reason. Yet even as the flames of the Inquisition continued to claim victims, winds of change were slowly quelling the fires of heretic persecution in Europe. The Reformation had shattered the Catholic Church's absolute authority and unity. Exhausted by the religious wars, some rulers began to practice limited tolerance of differing faiths within their realms. In 1598, France's King Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, granting French Protestants, the Huguenots, the right to worship and participate in public life. The Dutch Republic, after throwing off the yoke of Catholic Spain, decreed freedom of private religious conscience in 1579. In Britain, the last heretic burned at the stake was Edward Whiteman, a radical Anabaptist executed in 1612. The crime of heresy would remain a capital offence there until 1677. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, led by luminaries like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, had begun to advance knowledge through empirical observation and challenge centuries of church doctrine presented as indisputable fact. The Enlightenment of the 18th century would further erode traditional religious authority, as philosophers like Voltaire, Locke, and Kant championed individual liberty, religious tolerance, and the triumph of reason over superstition. The French philosopher Montesquieu, in his influential 1748 treatise, The Spirit of Laws, wrote that the law ought to impose no other penalties but such as are absolutely and evidently necessary, directly challenging the cruel corporal punishments of heretics that had long been considered essential. Reforms were slow and uneven, but the days of the Inquisition were numbered as the foundational notions of the modern age: pluralism, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, began their ascent. In 1834, the Spanish Inquisition, the last formal inquisition in Europe, was finally abolished after nearly 350 years. By the dawn of the 20th century, the once seemingly absolute power of religious authorities to dictate the thoughts and beliefs of others, under threat of death, had crumbled under the march of modernity. Yet the scars of the age of heretics linger, in the estimated tens of thousands tortured and executed by inquisitions, in the millions more murdered in religious wars and genocidal conquests waged in the name of enforcing orthodoxy. To study the plight of medieval heretics is to confront how the admirable human need to understand the divine, when alloyed with unchecked power and intolerance, can descend into horrific repression. It is also to marvel at the stubborn human will to hold fast to one's deepest beliefs, even unto death, that helped drive forward the frontiers of human conscience. Though we've largely relegated the crimes of the Inquisition to the darker passages of history, the struggle to defend freedom of thought against those who consider dissent dangerous is an eternal one. In the haunting words of the Spanish writer Jorge Luis Borges, "Heresy is the lifeblood of religions. It's faith that heresies renew." So let us end this journey into times past here, with both a sober appreciation for how far we've come, and vigilance for how far we still have to go in protecting the right of all to live and believe as their conscience demands. Not so long ago, the kind of open discussion of differing ideas many of us take for granted today would have been enough to brand one as a heretic, deserving of the cruelest torments the pious could conjure. As you drift into sleep, perhaps spare a thought for the countless heretics, named and nameless, famous and forgotten, who perished in flames for daring to imagine and proclaim a world beyond the limits of religious orthodoxy. Their sacrifices paved a slow and tortuous path towards the greater freedoms of belief we cherish today. And their hard example demands we remain ever watchful against the seductive pull of dogma over free thought. Only in remembering the hard lessons of history can we guard against repeating its darkest chapters. Until next time, I wish you restful, reflective dreams. Here is the continuation of the calm, immersive, historical bedtime story, elaborating on the approved outline. The Spanish Inquisition took the persecution of heretics to new heights under the leadership of Tomás de Torquemada. Born into a family of conversos, or Jewish converts to Catholicism, Torquemada rose through the ranks of the Dominican order to become the first Inquisitor General of Spain in 1483. Fueled by his zealous faith and suspicions about the sincerity of Jewish and Muslim converts, Torquemada expanded and intensified the Spanish Inquisition's activities. Under Torquemada's direction, a new court was established in Seville to investigate heresy among conversos. Inquisitors would arrive in a town, announce an edict of grace offering leniency for those who confessed to heresy and named other suspects, then begin their interrogations. The accused were assumed guilty unless proven innocent and rarely allowed to confront their accusers directly. Those who confessed promptly might receive a lighter punishment like public penance, fines, or brief imprisonment. But those who refused to admit to heretical beliefs or practices faced harsher fates. Suspects could languish in dank inquisitorial prisons for months or years before their trials, weakening their resolve. If torture was deemed necessary to extract a confession, it was done out of sight of the inquisitors themselves in darkened chambers. Common methods of torture included stretching victims on the rack, forcing them to ingest and regurgitate vast quantities of water, and even the strappado, where the accused, hands bound behind their back, would be repeatedly lifted into the air and dropped, dislocating their shoulders. Most prisoners would eventually confess to anything asked of them to stop the pain. Once guilt was established, punishments were doled out in public spectacles known as autos de fe, or acts of faith. Heretics would march in procession wearing dunce caps and the feared San Benito, a knee-length yellow gown, before crowds of onlookers. There they would hear their sentences read aloud, either reconciled to the church through penance and humiliation, or relaxed, that is, handed over to secular authorities to be burned alive at the stake. Torquemada himself presided over several massive autos da fe, including one in Toledo in 1486, featuring over 700 penitents, and another in 1492, where two of his own nephews were burned as Judaizing heretics. Under his leadership, the Spanish Inquisition executed an estimated 2,000 people between 1480 and 1530, roughly half of them conversos. But the Spanish Inquisition targeted more than just converts of questionable sincerity. It also pursued Moriscos, Muslims who had been forcibly converted to Catholicism, often using a mere failure to eat pork or speak Arabic as evidence of secret heresy. And in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to the Americas, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, at Torquemada's urging, issued the Alhambra decree expelling all unconverted Jews from Spain. Torquemada died in 1498, but the Spanish Inquisition he had shaped so forcefully continued on for centuries, spreading to Spanish colonies in the Americas and rooting out heretical behavior as small as blasphemous speech or owning banned books. The auto da fe of Seville in 1660 alone lasted 3 days and featured 300 penitents. While the notorious brutality of the Spanish Inquisition made it something of an outlier, inquisitions in other medieval kingdoms were not exactly gentle affairs. In France, the Dominican Robert le Bourgre earned the epithet the Hammer of Heretics for his enthusiastic persecution of the Cathars and Waldensians in the 13th century. He oversaw the burning of 180 Cathars in one day at Montweimer in 1239. And after the Church's initial attempts to persuade heretical sects, like the Waldensians, back into the Catholic fold, failed, it turned to more forceful methods. In the Bull ad Extirpanda, issued in 1252, Pope Innocent IV explicitly authorized the use of torture to discover and root out heresy, which church leaders increasingly viewed as both spiritual and political threats to Christendom. Medieval inquisitions operated under this papal authority to investigate religious dissent across Europe. Historians estimate they tried around 100,000 individuals in their 600 years of activity and executed about 2% of them, the vast majority by burning at the stake. This death toll may seem almost mild compared to the millions killed in modern genocides, but it created a chilling climate of conformity. Imagine the paranoia of knowing your neighbors could at any time accuse you of heresy for a stray word or action, whisking you away to dank dungeons and searing tortures until you confessed to whatever you were charged with. And if you didn't confess, a gruesome public execution likely awaited, as crowds jeered and flames melted your flesh away. To be a heretic, or even suspected of heresy, in medieval times was to face the very real and horrific prospect of a painful, humiliating demise. Of course, the grim fate of heretics makes for quite a morbid bedtime tale. But rest easy knowing that while the crime of heresy is still on the books in some countries like Andorra and Liechtenstein, no one has been executed for their beliefs in those places for centuries. The last person put to death for heresy in Britain was Edward Whiteman, burned at the stake in 1612 for his unorthodox views on the Trinity and soul sleep. While the terrible tribulations of medieval heretics may not exactly be a soothing nightcap, there is still something oddly relaxing about drifting off while pondering the peculiarities of history and human nature. The measured recitation of esoteric details creates almost a droning, meditative effect, occupying the mind just enough to keep it from daily stresses and worries that might otherwise keep you awake. So as you begin to nod off, let the strange and brutal world of medieval heretics dissolve into hazy dreams, secure that whatever metaphorical inquisitions you may face in your own life, at least you won't be literally burned at the stake for your troubles. A silver lining to savor as you slip into hopefully more pleasant reveries. Good night, and don't let the heretic hunters bite. But the persecution of heretics in medieval times didn't end with the Spanish Inquisition or the smouldering embers of Edward Whiteman. Even as the Renaissance began to dawn over Europe in the 14th century, ushering in a new age of art, science, and humanism, religious dissenters continued to face the unyielding wrath of the Church and its inquisitors. One of the most prominent heretics of this transitional era was the English theologian and reformer John Wycliffe. Born around 1320 to a well-off family in Yorkshire, Wycliffe received an elite education at Oxford, earning his doctorate in theology and becoming a celebrated scholar and teacher. But amid the medieval church's growing worldliness and corruption, Wycliffe began to advocate for a humbler, purer Christianity that hewed more closely to the example of Jesus and the apostles. Wycliffe criticized the wealth and power of the clergy, arguing that the church should voluntarily give up its property and earthly authority. He championed the authority of Scripture over popes and church councils. And most radically, he worked to translate the Latin Vulgate Bible into Middle English so that common people could read the Word of God for themselves, not relying on priests to interpret it for them. These stances quickly drew condemnation from the church hierarchy. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI issued 5 papal bulls against Wycliffe, accusing him of heresy and forbidding him to teach his controversial ideas. But protected by powerful patrons like John of Gaunt, Wycliffe managed to avoid arrest and trial, continuing to develop his reformist theology until his death from natural causes in 1384. However, while Wycliffe himself eluded the Inquisitor's grasp, his followers were not so lucky. The Lollards, as they came to be known, carried on Wycliffe's teachings after his death, preaching against clerical abuses, performing vernacular Bible readings, and even ordaining their own poor priests to minister to the people. In 1395, the 12 Conclusions of the Lollards was nailed to the doors of Westminster Abbey, attacking the church's corruption in terms strikingly similar to Martin Luther's later 95 Theses. Unsurprisingly, the Church did not take kindly to this open defiance. In 1401, Henry IV passed the Statute of Heresy, also known as the De Heretico Comburendo, explicitly legalizing the burning of English heretics. Lollardy was denounced as a heresy at the Council of Constance in 1415, the same council that condemned the Czech reformer Jan Hus to the stake for his own proto-Protestant views. Over the next century, the Lollards faced waves of persecution, forcing them to meet in secret, with followers often referring to each other by code names to avoid detection. Possession of Wycliffe's banned vernacular Bible became a serious crime. Those caught with illegal scriptures could face imprisonment, torture, or worse. One of the most prominent Lollards burned at the stake was John Badby, a humble tailor who refused to renounce his belief that the consecrated Eucharistic bread was not literally Christ's body. Condemned as a heretic, Badby was burned alive in a barrel in 1410, though legend has it that the Prince of Wales, later Henry V, took pity on him and offered him a full pardon if he would only recant. Badby refused, insisting that if every host consecrated at the altar were the Lord's body, then there be 20,000 gods in England. He died in the flames, still proclaiming his dissenting views on transubstantiation. The Lollard movement was gradually stamped out in England by the 16th century, but its calls for accessible scriptures and resistance to church authority deeply influenced later reformers. Indeed, some historians see Lollardy as the true beginning of the English Reformation, over a century before Henry VIII's famous break with Rome. So while Wycliffe's heretical belief in the Bible translated into common tongues is accepted by most Christians today, it came at a deadly cost for many of his devoted disciples. Ponder that irony as you drift off, how heresy is so often in the eye of the beholder, with yesterday's dangerous radicals becoming tomorrow's canonized saints. What constant rebels we humans are, even against our own holy orders. But the medieval church didn't reserve its inquisitorial ire solely for breakaway sects and dissenting theologians. In one of the darkest and strangest chapters in the history of heresy, the institution that considered itself the bulwark of good against evil ended up demonizing and persecuting some of its own most zealously faithful members, the Franciscans. Founded by Francis of Assisi in 1209, the Franciscan order was based on an ideal of apostolic poverty, with friars renouncing all worldly possessions to live as mendicant wanderers, wholly dependent on the charity of others. This radical embrace of material deprivation stood in stark contrast to the opulent wealth of the Church, and the Franciscans quickly attracted ardent followers and powerful enemies. Even the papacy seemed unsure what to make of them at first. Pope Innocent III initially opposed Francis's vision of total poverty, while later popes wavered between praising the Franciscans as models of Christian humility and trying to rein in their more extreme ascetic practices. This tension came to a head in the early 14th century with the controversy over the spiritual Franciscans, or Fraticelli. The Fraticelli were a group of Franciscans who insisted on an exceptionally strict observance of poverty, to the point of arguing that Christ and his apostles had owned absolutely nothing, not even the clothes on their backs. When Pope John XXII rejected this doctrine of absolute poverty as heretical in 1323, the Fraticelli openly defied him, even accusing the Pope himself of heresy for betraying St. Francis's vision. Thus began a strange spectacle of the Catholic Church essentially declaring some of its most devout members to be enemies of the faith. The Fraticelli were excommunicated and turned over to inquisitors, with many imprisoned, tortured, and even burned at the stake as unrepentant heretics. One of the most famous spiritual Franciscans executed this way was Michele de Calci, burned alive in Florence in 1389. Yet even in the face of brutal persecution, the Fraticelli movement endured, stubbornly clinging to their belief in the holiness of absolute deprivation. Some fled to the mountains of central Italy, eking out a precarious existence as hermits and beggars, always fearful of being discovered and arrested for their prescribed Franciscan practices. Others sought refuge with sympathetic nobles or in monastic communities that turned a blind eye to their presence. Ultimately, the Fraticelli faded away by the early 15th century, their fanatical commitment to poverty proving unsustainable in a medieval church that had made its peace with worldly wealth and power. Today, they are little more than a historical curiosity, a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking religious ideals to self-destructive extremes. But there is still something poignant and strangely noble about these heretics of the cloth, men who chose to face torture and death rather than compromise their deeply held spiritual convictions. In a way, they embodied the purest ideals of St. Francis himself, a man who once stripped naked in the streets to dramatize his total detachment from earthly things. Imagine that kind of all-consuming, self-abnegating faith as you try to quiet your mind for the night. To believe in something so completely that you would gladly go to the stake for it, seeing even the searing flames as a final, glorious consummation of your unwavering devotion. It's a terrifying yet oddly captivating thought to turn over as you sink into unconsciousness. Of course, the actual experience of being burned alive is probably best left to the realm of uneasy nightmares rather than blissful bedtime reveries. And on that rather macabre note, we arrive at one of the grisliest and most notorious forms of medieval heretic persecution, the witch hunts. Though the exact origins of the European witch trials remain murky, fear of witchcraft and sorcery had long lurked at the edges of medieval Christian society. As far back as 906 CE, the Canon Episcopi condemned belief in witches as a heretic illusion, even as it acknowledged the existence of maleficium or harmful magic. Sorcery had long lurked at the edges of medieval Christian society. As far back as 906 CE, the Canon Episcopi condemned belief in witches as a heretical illusion, even as it acknowledged the existence of maleficium or harmful magic. But it wasn't until the 15th century that this simmering paranoia boiled over into full-fledged witch hunts. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Effectibus, essentially declaring that satanic witchcraft was real and needed to be rooted out by any means necessary. This unleashed a wave of witch trials that would wash over Europe for the next 2 centuries, fueled by popular superstition, religious fanaticism, and texts like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches. The basic contours of a witch trial followed the rough outlines of medieval heresy prosecutions, with accusations, interrogations, torture, and public punishments. But the process took on a uniquely surreal and misogynistic character when the accused were women suspected of cavorting with the devil. Superstitious tests for witchcraft abounded, from pricking an alleged witch to see if she bled, to tying her up and dunking her in water to see if she floated. If she sank, she was innocent. If she bobbed to the surface, she was in league with Satan. Confessions were coerced through all manner of ghoulish tortures, from thumbscrews and strappado to specially designed witch chairs studded with sharp spikes. Perhaps most chillingly, accused witches were encouraged to incriminate others, sparking a contagion of paranoia. In the German city of Bamberg, waves of arrests ballooned into a full-fledged witch panic in the 1620s, with suspects tortured into accusing their own friends and relatives. One of the most poignant accounts of this dark episode comes from Johannes Junius, a burgomaster who confessed under torture to fantastical crimes like flying on a broomstick and kissing the devil's backside. In a secret letter smuggled to his daughter from prison, Junius maintained his innocence, explaining that he had confessed in order to escape the great anguish and bitter torture. But his hopes for leniency were in vain. Junius was burned at the stake along with 300 other alleged witches, victims of a mania as irrational as it was merciless. While the total death toll of the European witch trials is difficult to determine, modern estimates range from 40,000 to 60,000 executed, with the vast majority women. Though these numbers are grim enough, it's worth remembering that they only hint at the much larger climate of suspicion and dread the witch hunts created, with countless innocents living in terror of accusation. As the scientific revolution gained steam in the 16th and 17th centuries, the intellectual landscape of Europe began to shift. Astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, with the Earth revolving around the Sun, a direct challenge to church doctrine, which placed Earth at the center of God's creation. Though initially condemned as heretical, these new scientific ideas sparked further questioning and investigation into the natural world. The Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century brought a new emphasis on reason, individualism, and skepticism toward traditional authorities, including the Church. Philosophers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Kant advocated for religious tolerance, freedom of thought, and the separation of church and state. The notion that one could be a moral person and a productive member of society without adhering to church doctrine gained traction among intellectuals. This isn't to say that charges of heresy disappeared overnight. The Catholic Church still wielded significant power and influence, especially in southern Europe. The Roman Inquisition, though diminished, continued to investigate and prosecute those accused of unorthodox beliefs. One of the most famous cases involved Galileo, who was tried in 1633 for promoting Copernican ideas. Under threat of torture, the elderly scientist was forced to recant his claims that the Earth moved around the Sun. He spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. Yet Galileo's trial would prove to be more the exception than the rule in a gradually secularizing Europe. The Protestant Reformation had already shattered the Church's monopoly on defining and punishing heresy. Now the Enlightenment provided an alternative source of truth and meaning outside of religion. The scientific revolution, with its emphasis on empirical observation and testing, presented a new method for understanding the world, one based on evidence rather than dogma. Of course, these changes didn't reach all corners of society equally or at the same time. Rural folk, especially in isolated areas, often retained a strong attachment to traditional Catholic beliefs and practices. Superstition, belief in magic, and fear of witchcraft lasted well into the 18th century in some regions. The last legal execution for witchcraft occurred in Switzerland in 1782, and the Spanish Inquisition wasn't officially abolished until 1834. But the tide was slowly turning. The intellectual and cultural shifts of the 17th and 18th centuries created space for dissent, debate, and new ideas, at least among the educated classes. The notion that someone could be persecuted or executed simply for holding unorthodox religious beliefs was becoming increasingly untenable in a more enlightened age. In France, the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen, born out of the French Revolution in 1789, enshrined freedom of religion as a fundamental human right. Article 10 stated, "No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law." Though it would take time for these principles to be fully realized in practice, the Declaration marked an important symbolic break, with centuries of religious persecution. The 19th century saw the continued decline of the Church's temporal power and the rise of secular nation-states. The unification of Italy in 1870 stripped the Pope of his last vestiges of earthly authority, as the Papal States were absorbed into the new Kingdom of Italy. Though the Church still railed against what it saw as the dangers of modernism and secularism, its ability to enforce religious conformity through coercion and violence was largely a thing of the past. Looking back from our vantage point in the 21st century, the medieval persecution of heretics can appear shocking in its brutality and intolerance. It's easy to view our ancestors as backward, superstitious, or just plain cruel. But it's important to remember that they inhabited a very different mental and social world than our own. For medieval people, the stakes of religious deviance couldn't have been higher. One's eternal soul hung in the balance. Most inquisitors and church authorities believed they were doing the necessary, even righteous work of stamping out the contagion of heresy that threatened to damn countless souls to hell. Heretics weren't just people with unorthodox opinions, but actual agents of the devil, sowing discord and doubt. In a world suffused with the divine, there could be no room for compromise or tolerance when it came to matters of faith. Of course, this worldview was eventually challenged and transformed by the religious, intellectual, and political upheavals of the early modern period. But the story of how heretics were treated in medieval times remains a fascinating and sobering window into the past. It's a reminder of the power of belief to shape societies and drive human behavior for good and for ill. As we reflect on this history from our modern secular perspective, it's worth considering how our own deeply held beliefs, religious and otherwise, continue to influence our thoughts and actions in ways we're not always fully aware of. While the specific content of belief changes over time, the human capacity for conviction and the desire to enforce conformity to those convictions seems to be a constant across the ages. The story of medieval heretics is a cautionary tale about the dangers of rigid dogmatism and the persecution of dissent. But it's also a testament to the enduring human struggle to make sense of our world, grapple with ultimate questions, and live according to our deepest values, even in the face of incredible pressure to conform. In that sense, perhaps we have more in common with our medieval forebears than we'd like to think. Though their specific beliefs and practices may seem alien to us now, their search for meaning, truth, and salvation is one that still resonates across the centuries. As we drift off to sleep, we can ponder the strange and complex journey that has brought us to where we are today, and dream of a future where differences of belief are met with understanding and compassion rather than persecution and violence. As we've seen, the medieval church went to great lengths to stamp out what it saw as the scourge of heresy. But perhaps no group would face as relentless a persecution throughout the Middle Ages as the Cathars. Imagine, if you will, the rolling green hills and quaint villages of Languedoc in southern France. Today, it's an idyllic, tranquil place. But in the 13th century, this was ground zero for a religious and military conflict that would change the face of Europe. Here, far from the grandeur of Paris or the bustle of Rome, a group of humble, passionate believers had the audacity to reject some core tenets of Catholic orthodoxy. The Cathars, as they came to be known, didn't believe in the sacraments, the Trinity, or even that Jesus was the Son of God. To the medieval church authorities, such views weren't just incorrect, they were dangerous heresies that threatened the very foundations of Christendom. The Cathars traced their origins to the Bogomils, a dualist sect that had spread from the Balkans in the 10th century. They believed that the world was a battleground between the forces of good and evil, with the material world being inherently sinful and corrupt. To the Cathars, the path to salvation lay in renouncing the flesh and embracing an ascetic lifestyle of poverty, chastity, and vegetarianism. At first, the Catholic Church tried to bring the Cathars back into the fold through persuasion and debate. Preachers were sent to Languedoc to convince them of the error of their ways. When theological arguments failed, the Church turned to harsher methods. In 1208, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a full-scale military campaign to wipe out the Cathars by force. For over 20 years, the lush fields and fortified towns of Languedoc became a battleground. The Crusaders, led by zealous French noblemen like Simon de Montfort, swept through the region, laying siege to Cathar strongholds and slaughtering suspected heretics by the thousands. At the massacre of Béziers in 1209, the monk Arnaud Amalric allegedly declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own." A chilling statement that captured the brutality of the age. But military might alone wasn't enough to stamp out the Cathar heresy. Their beliefs had taken deep root among the local populace, who saw the Catholic clergy as corrupt and decadent. To truly eradicate the heresy, the Church needed a more systematic, targeted approach. That's where the medieval Inquisition comes in. In 1231, nearly a decade after the Albigensian Crusade had ended, Pope Gregory IX established the Papal Inquisition, a network of tribunals tasked with investigating and prosecuting heresy. Suddenly, the hunt for Cathars took on a terrifying new dimension. Armed with sweeping powers and a seal of papal authority, inquisitors like the formidable Conrad of Marburg and the learned Bernard Gouy began a reign of religious terror across Languedoc. The inquisitors were nothing if not thorough. They would arrive in a town, announce their presence, and invite the locals to come forward and confess any heretical beliefs or activities. Those who failed to do so faced a grim fate. Suspicion alone was enough to land one in an inquisitorial prison, where torture was routinely used to extract confessions. The lucky ones might get off with a light penance, a fine, perhaps, or a humiliating public confession. But for the truly unrepentant, the Inquisition reserved its harshest punishment: death at the stake. In town squares across Languedoc, condemned Cathars and those who sheltered them were led out in front of jeering crowds to be tied to a post, with bundles of firewood piled at their feet. As the flames licked higher and the smoke grew thick, the heretic would have one last chance to repent. Though it was little more than a cruel formality, we can only imagine the terror that gripped the people of Languedoc in those grim times. Parents would warn their children to keep their heads down, not to say anything that might seem like Cathar sympathy. Neighbours turned against neighbours, with grudges and rumours sending whole families to the pyre. Even the nobility wasn't safe. The inquisitors made a grim example of the wealthy Cathar patron Raymond Roger de Trencavel, imprisoning him for years before burning him at the stake in 1263. But no single event captures the brutality of the anti-Cathar persecutions, quite like the siege of Montségur in 1243–44. Perched high in the Pyrenees Mountains, this imposing castle had become a last refuge for the Cathars and their protectors. For months, the besieging Catholic armies hurled stones and launched assaults against its high walls, to no avail. Only after a long winter and a betrayal from within did Montségur finally fall in March of 1244. What followed was an act of cold, calculated slaughter. Some 200 Cathars, having refused to recant their beliefs, were marched down the mountain, corralled onto a wooden pyre at the base, and put to the torch en masse. As the flames engulfed them and the smell of burning flesh choked the air, the inquisitors looked on with grim satisfaction, confident that they had finally destroyed the Cathar heresy once and for all. In a sense, they were right. Though small pockets of Cathars would linger on for a few decades more, Montségur marked the effective end of their existence as an organized religious movement. The apparatus of the Inquisition, refined in the crucible of Languedoc, would go on to be deployed against other heresies over the coming centuries. But the sheer scale and savagery of the Cathar persecutions was never quite equaled. Today, the Cathars are little more than a grim memory, a cautionary tale from a distant, more intolerant age. But their ghosts still seem to linger in the hills and valleys of Languedoc, where crumbling castles and ruined monasteries stand as silent witnesses to their suffering. As we move on to explore other heresies that drew the wrath of the medieval church, let us pause to remember the Cathars, those humble, dedicated believers who paid the ultimate price for daring to dissent. As the smoke billowed from the pyre, the condemned heretic Johannes Junius called out one final time, proclaiming his innocence to the very end. His secret letter smuggled from prison told the harrowing story. How he was accused of witchcraft, tortured mercilessly until he confessed to impossible acts, and sentenced to burn. Junius was far from alone in this cruel fate. Across 16th and 17th century Europe, the zeal to stamp out heresy and witchcraft reached a feverish intensity. From town squares to abbeys, the fires of the stake lit up the night, fueled by the twisted logic of demonologists like Heinrich Kramer, whose infamous Malleus Maleficarum manual launched witch hunting to new heights of systematized brutality. Battered under torture and the threat of eternal damnation, countless innocent victims confessed to flying on brooms, cursing crops, consorting with demons, sealing their doom. But even as the flames consumed the bodies of the condemned, the ideas that challenged religious orthodoxy could not be so easily extinguished. In 1517, a little-known German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, criticizing the Catholic Church's corruption and arguing for a return to the Bible as the ultimate spiritual authority. Luther's revolutionary ideas spread like wildfire, aided by the newly invented printing press. Across Europe, people eagerly read the scriptures in their own languages for the first time, discovering a liberating faith without the church as middleman. For the Catholic hierarchy, it was the ultimate heresy. Luther was excommunicated and declared an outlaw, but protected by German princes, he escaped the fate of earlier reformers like Jan Hus, burned at the stake for similar critiques a century before. The tide was slowly turning. The Protestant Reformation fractured the Church's monopoly on truth. Gutenberg's press democratized knowledge. The scientific revolution unleashed an explosion of discovery, unraveling the medieval cosmology that placed the Church at the center of the universe. Galileo gazed through his telescope and saw the moons of Jupiter, demolishing the old Aristotelian model of the heavens. For such heresies, he faced the Inquisition and house arrest. But the Church could not arrest the march of science and reason. As the Enlightenment dawned, philosophers like Locke, Voltaire, and Diderot argued for tolerance, evidence, and individual liberty. The last heretic burned in Britain in 1612, though it took until 1677 for the crime to be taken off the books for good. In 1633, the Inquisition had forced Galileo to recant his heretical notion that the Earth revolved around the sun. It took until 1992 for the Vatican to formally admit that Galileo was right. From where we stand today, the medieval persecution of heretics seems almost incomprehensible in its cruelty and illogic. It's tempting to view our ancestors as uniquely backwards or barbaric. But we must remember the power of the medieval worldview, a cosmology not of atoms and galaxies, but of angels and demons, omens and ordeals, eternal salvation and damnation. In that world, on the knife edge between heaven and hell, heresy endangered body and soul. Those who deviated threatened to drag all of Christendom into the inferno. Certitude can be comforting, but as the intellectual martyrs of the medieval world taught us, truth doesn't fear doubt, and authority doesn't equal accuracy. From the Cathars to Luther, the Waldensians to Galileo, those who dared to dissent often met terrible fates. But their ideas and their sacrifice laid the foundations for our age of reason and rights. So let us learn from the intolerance of the past and cherish the hard-won freedom to think, believe, and question as our conscience dictates. As you drift off tonight, soothed by the knowledge of how far we've come, consider giving a sleepy little thumbs up to honor those who defended truth against the flames. From all of us here, sleep well and dream of a brighter tomorrow. Good night.